right? Thanking God for the way that he helps us properly place value on things in life. Let's call this chapter Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 12. Let's call it cheap because of the way that Herod seems to consider life cheap. In this chapter that starts out in the first 5 verses describing the way that Herod, the ruler, is going to kill James, the brother of John, one of the apostles, and seeing how much favor it gains him among that portion of the Hebrew people who are actually still hating the church, he is going to take Peter into custody and line him up as next for execution. Understanding that he is going to guard him with 4 squads of soldiers. But the end of that section of verses is going to talk about the way that the prayers, genuine prayers, went up for Peter at that time. Understanding that's going to be important because in verses 6 through 17, it's going to describe the way that Peter is actually freed by another instance of divine intervention, this time directly by the intervention of an angel of God who is going to help Peter escape. Peter himself, thinking he is caught up in a vision or a dream, is not going to believe it until he is out of the jail and looking for the brothers, at which point he is going to go and knock at a place where he knows the brothers have gathered, and they aren't going to believe it either. And likewise, they're not going to be the only ones who are going to find it hard to believe. Herod is going to find it hard to believe that he has escaped with that many people around him. In verses 18 through 19, he is going to inquire and think it best to have the sentries killed, those who were guarding Peter, as he is going to move on about his business, not realizing that he, as the saying goes, is skating on thin ice. He's going to go on about his business, handling business with another group of folks he is upset with, the residents of, I think it's Tyre and Sidon. And as he goes to venture off in a situation where they are essentially quaking because they are actually in need of his assistance, he's going to give a speech, and quite possibly not so much impressed by the speech as much as their need for his assistance. They are going to say the voice of a God and not a man, at which point God's going to strike him dead for not giving glory to God, as the chapter is going to end up kind of in the same cold manner that Herod seemed to take the lives of the Christians and his own soldiers. It's going to talk about the way that the word is simply going to move on and grow after Herod has fallen. And in particular, in verse 25, it's going to talk about the way that Barnabas and Saul and John Mark move on about their business, once again, as God has dealt with Herod almost as quickly as Herod had begun to cheapen life, reminding me of why the whole concept of cheap seems to be a good title for this chapter, a good theme to consider, because it reminded me of the way that it can be really dangerous to cheapen the lives of others, because in cheapening the lives of others, that's a great way to cheapen our own lives, as Herod seems to have learned the hard way, understanding that we are in times when, as we mentioned from time to time, lawlessness seems to be just increasing as it's prophesied in the word. But in times where those who are unjust end up in unfortunate circumstances, God does not necessarily require our hearts to go out in circumstances where he is dealing with injustice in much the same way he is dealing with a Herod, but in situations where we begin to warm up to the injustice to the point where we don't care when lives are taken in unjust circumstances. That's a very difficult, or that's a dangerous condition to allow our hearts to get into, because as Herod killed James, not for any legal or just reason, but simply to gain favor with the people. And as he had Peter lined up for that same fate in a killing that would have been no more just than the killing of James. And then even worse, he is going to, without doing a proper investigation to find out whether or not his own soldiers were really at fault, possibly as a matter of convenience or just to prove a point, he likewise is for a third time going to order the unjust death of his own soldiers. And so by the time we get to the end of the chapter, he's gotten into the habit of approving the deaths of those who weren't actually guilty. And so by the time he gets up to make a speech, he's on thin ice, not realizing that the smallest of infractions are plenty justification for God to now kill him. And so in a situation where others might have found mercy, Herod, for the infraction of simply not giving glory to God in a time when glory to God was due, found out the hard way that his life had become cheap.